I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video what we're going to do is to configure a channel strip setting for a vocal. Now, without question, vocals are the track element that people have the most questions about. How loud should vocals be? How bright should they be? How much compression? How much reverb? All kinds of things. And of course, I'm afraid to say the answer is there is no one-size-fits-all solution. A vocal is the bit that everyone's going to remember the most from the track that you work on, but exactly what the settings are that allow it to sit with the other elements in your mix, well, that's up to you. There is no one solution which is going to work for every single track that you work on. And of course, really, that's a good thing. It means that we get to be creative every single time we record a vocal with different singers through different microphones and for different tracks at different tempos in different genres. Of course, it's no surprise that there isn't a single solution that's going to work for every single track. So what we're going to do is we're going to build what's called a channel strip setting, a series of plugins, one after another, all of which are going to play a role in shaping a vocal sound and making it, hopefully, as good as it can be within the context of this piece. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear this very short little song, or this element of this song, this section of it, and at the moment the vocal within it is completely dry. There is nothing affecting it. You can see the channel over here on the left hand side currently has absolutely no plugin set up. So let's have a listen to it dry.
Loving ain't simple with you anymore. We have become opposites. No, loving ain't simple with you anytime. Battle lines drawn.
Okay, so you can hear that overall the track's quite ambient. It's got a nice sort of amount of wash and space in it, and at the moment the vocal sounds very dry and very close. Now, actually, there's something really nice about that. It immediately means that the vocal is near the sort of front of the mix, and immediately, therefore, it's going to catch our attention because it's closer to us than anything else that's within the track. But obviously it's not right. I'm not suggesting for a second that this vocal is finished as it is right now. So before we start getting into configuring channel strip solutions, let's first of all just have a look at this vocal part. You can see its waveform. You can see that at the moment, whilst the waveform isn't the biggest waveform in the world, therefore the volume of the way that this has been recorded hasn't been recorded super loud, it's also not too quiet either. We've got something which is just sort of contained, and that's about the right volume for us. But overall, in playing this file back, it's absolutely clear that the vocal isn't loud enough. Now, we can configure volume in all sorts of ways. We can use volume automation to bring its volume up. We're going to compress this signal as well, which is going to give us the opportunity to make it louder overall. But I'm also just going to point out this little gain control that's up here in the top left-hand corner. What this allows me to do is to produce a gain offset. So if ever you want to increase the gain of a vocal, let's say I decide I want to push it all up by 2 dB in gain, I've done that, and you can see that the whole waveform is just sort of grown in size. So effectively what we've done is just to add a little bit of extra gain to this file before we start processing it. Okay, what I'm going to do is to start thinking about the things I might want to change about a vocal in the context of placing it within my project. And they all relate to tone and volume. Tone is going to be covered by EQ, and volume is going to be covered by a combination of compression, de-essing, and then volume automation as well. So 3 things we're going to do in order to make sure that the volume is behaving the way we want it to, and we're going to start with tone. Now, within Logic, what we have a chance to do is simply double click here within this EQ pane, and what will happen is that Logic will launch its EQ channel. So straight away, what I've got a chance to do now is to think about the tone of this vocal overall. Now, the temptation always is to solo a vocal and to start thinking about its tone by itself, and that's fine. There's merit in that. But remember, mixing is all about placing a sound in the context of a song. So remember, be making sure that you're constantly toggling between soloing your vocal to hear it intimately and by itself, and also then placing it back into the context of your track so that you're constantly making sure that the changes that you're making make sense in the context of your piece. Now, what I want here is, I actually like the tone of this vocal, but I want to just be enhancing certain things about it. Let's just listen to it completely by itself.
Loving ain't simple with you anymore. We have become opposites. No, loving ain't simple with you anytime. Battle lines drawn.
Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just to add a little bit more air to it. I'm going to just make sure that anything that's happening at the sort of top end of this has just got a little bit more space. Now, the way that I can do that is you can see that the moment I start hovering over the individual parts, or there's different frequency groups within this channel EQ without me even clicking anything, you can see that what I'm effectively doing is I'm moving from one band of this EQ to the next. And you can see that as I hover, each band corresponds to the shape that's above it. And right up here at the top, what I've got a chance to do is to add what's called a shelf. A shelf EQ basically says, okay, here is the lowest point, and above that, frequencies are going to be turned up in volume. So not around a particular point, that's what we call a bell curve, and that's what these others are. So rather than saying, okay, here is the bottom and the top of a particular frequency group, and I'm going to boost volume inside that, a shelf turns volume up above a particular point, or at the bottom end below a particular point. So what I'm going to do is just to add a little bit of air into this project using a shelf, which basically means that all of the frequencies above 4.8 kilohertz are going to be boosted by up to 4 decibels. So what that you can see down here at the bottom is I've got the individual settings for every frequency group that I'm working on. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to the low mid-range, which is here. You can see the little sort of footprint, the outline of the vocal, the sort of little legacy of the waveform that it produced is here. And in here, I've got some low mids that what I want to do is just clear a little bit of space out of. So what I'm going to do here is to produce a dip. Now, you can see that as I drag this down, the dip's quite wide. It starts all the way down here in the bass, and it comes all the way up. It's still having an effect at 1 kilohertz. All I really want to do is to go after a much narrower group of frequencies around this particular point. So what I've got here is the frequency itself, 272 hertz. I've got the amount of volume drop. That's going to be too extreme, but we'll leave it at sort of minus 5.2 at the moment. And underneath, I've got what's called the bandwidth. And what that allows me to do is to make the band either much narrower for making what we call surgical changes. It's like going in and making a very precise change to a particular frequency group, or making a much more general wide change. Well, I want to make a relatively surgical choice here without being too extreme. There isn't one nasty little frequency which is poking out, which really needs addressing. I'm just making a slightly more nuanced choice than that. And as I say, 5.2 is going to be too much. I want to just roll out a little bit less. Okay. So we've made 2 changes. What we're going to hear is something very subtle, sort of in the low mid-range, and hopefully something a little bit more obvious at the top end. Let's first of all hear the vocal again with no EQ, and I'm going to just sort of punch it in halfway through.
Loving ain't simple with you anymore. We have become opposites. No, loving ain't simple with you anytime. Battle lines drawn.
Okay, now that is a subtle change, but what we suddenly get is this sort of air and this warmth, and again, a little bit more clarity in the vocal. So we're going to leave it there for a moment. We might come back and make more EQ changes in a little while, but we've begun the process of just thinking about, first of all, reducing a little bit of frequency content we don't want and enhancing frequency content we do want. Okay, let's close the EQ, and what I'm going to do next is to put in a compressor. That's in the Dynamics folder of plugins, and within the compressor, what I've got a chance to do is to first of all choose the type of compressor that I want to use. So we've got a range of different options here across the top, and the one that I'm interested in is this one. This is the Studio FET model, and what compression is going to allow me to do is to reduce the dynamic range between the quietest and the loudest moments of this vocal. Now, actually the dynamic range of this particular vocal isn't that wide. It's been performed broadly with this slightly whispered tone, and as you can see from the waveform, I haven't got massive spikes and huge drops in volume. I've got a relatively consistent volume. So the amount of compression that I'm going to need is going to be much less than if I had a vocal which was much more extreme in terms of dynamic range. So I'm going to set a threshold to make sure that I'm catching the point above which I want compression to occur. I'm going to set the ratio, which is the amount of compression I want to apply, and then makeup gain, well, we get to control that in a little while. That allows us to bring back in any lost volume that occurs as a result of using compression. What I am going to do, however, is to turn off auto gain. I want to be deciding how much louder it gets rather than have Logic choose that for me automatically. What I'm also going to do in a moment as we play it back is to configure the attack and release speeds. They're about how quickly the compression begins once the signal exceeds the threshold point, and equally how quickly it recovers after the volume drops back down through it. So there's no way for me to make settings to this compressor without actually listening to the vocal as it plays back. So let's do that now.
Loving ain't simple with you anymore. We have become opposites. No, loving ain't simple with you anytime. Battle lines drawn.
Okay, well, in solo mode, that sounds like it's working quite well. Remember what I said a few minutes ago? What we're going to need to do at the moment is to put it back into the context of the piece and see whether or not these changes I've made both to the channel strip and, to the EQ and to the compressor are working. But what we've got here is a vocal which is producing about up to 5 decibels of drop. What we've got is a ratio which is just squeezing dynamics a little bit tighter. And one thing I did was to increase the release time so that as our singer gets quieter at the end of each phrase or word, rather than the compressor sort of slamming back up to 0, what that's happening now with a longer release time is it's just taking a little bit longer for the compressor to recover. And what you'll find is that attack and release times really make a huge difference sort of depending on the speed of the vocal that you're compressing. So we've got this sort of slow, quite ambient track. If you're working on something much more up-tempo, you might find that both attack and release times benefit from being a little bit shorter. Okay, let's put the vocal back into the track and see what effect our plugins are having so far.
Loving ain't simple with you anymore. We have become opposites. No, loving ain't simple with you anytime. Battle lines drawn.
And let's immediately compare that to the unprocessed version. I'm just turning off these 2 power lights for these plugins.
Loving ain't simple with you anymore. We have become opposites. No, loving ain't simple with you anytime. Battle lines drawn.
Now, that low mid cut is much easier to hear in the context of the piece with the other elements that are playing. What we've got is this slightly resonant quality in the vocalist's voice around that particular frequency area. That's not a criticism of the vocal performance at all, which I absolutely love. It's just simply the fact that that person's voice through that microphone recorded in a particular room has created that resonance. And what I wanted to do is just rein that in a little bit so that it's not making its presence felt in the same way. So that's really made a big difference. And we've got this extra air in the vocal now as well. Okay, now the next plugin I want to have a look at is called a de-esser. And what it does is it addresses a particular frequency group that can be problematic in the mix. And that's what we call sibilant sounds, or S sounds. S sounds tend to light up really brightly, and what they tend to do is to produce these little surges of extra energy. Now remember, what I've done so far is I've added a high shelf to my EQ, which means that all of the highest frequencies have been turned up in volume. And what that tends to do is to make any sibilant issues even worse, because we've just made all of those high frequency little S sounds even brighter than they were before. So we're going to address that now. So what I'm going to do is to come into the dynamics options again, and here is Logic's de-esser, which looks like this. This is a scalable plugin. So if you find that when you open it, it's very small, you can very easily stretch this out and make it a little bit bigger. So what we've got within a de-esser is a frequency dependent dynamics control. What that basically means is it's effectively going to look at the volume of a part of a sound around a specific group of frequencies. So in other words, rather than simply turning volume up and down across the entire frequency range, it's just going to focus on one band of frequencies. And the first thing I can do is to select what that group of frequencies is going to be over here on the right-hand side via the frequency selection. What I've then got a chance to do is to set a threshold, a bit like a compressor, to say, okay, above what volume do I want to be addressing any sibilance and beginning to turn its volume down? And then what I've got a chance to do is to select its maximum potential reduction. How much volume drop do I want to take out of this sound at the most in order to address any sibilant problems? Well, the best way to understand de-essing is for us to actually just see it in action. I'm going to press play and we'll watch this vocal through, and what we're going to see is that when any S sounds come along, the de-esser is going to find them and it's going to reduce their volume. We can then control exactly how extreme that's going to be using these controls.
Loving ain't simple with you anymore. We have become opposites.
Okay, so we can hear on the word simple towards the beginning of the song that what we're seeing, first of all, is that the volume of that S sound is being detected. Where is it being detected? Well, at the moment it's being detected at 6.3 kilohertz. And what we have a chance to do, depending on the threshold setting and the maximum reduction setting, is to decide how much volume drop we're going to take out as a result of this de-essing process. How much is too much? Well, I've already answered that question. That's up to you to decide. There is no fixed amount. There is no right setting here, which is the correct amount. How sibilant is your vocalist? Which microphone did you use? How bright is it? How bright is the room that you're working in? And how much of an issue is this that you want to address? All entirely your choices to make. Let's put this back into context within the piece.
Loving ain't simple with you anymore. We have become opposites. No, loving ain't simple with you anytime. Battle lines drawn.
Okay, so I'm racing through this, but something like that feels okay to me. What we've got is just a little bit of attenuation. That's the word we use for volume drop on the areas where we've got little problem spots. I haven't gone too hard on it because what I don't want to do is to lose all of that extra brightness that we've put in with the EQ. So what we've now got is 3 separate plugins which are affecting the way that the vocal is playing back. Overall tone, controlled by channel EQ. We've got some compression, which is sorting out the dynamic range and just keeping that a little bit tighter than it was at the recording stage. And now we've got a little bit of de-essing too. And as a result, what we've done is we've placed our vocal into the track a little bit more and just given it a little bit more clarity. What we haven't done yet is to think about space. Now, we've got this very ambient track, and at the moment our vocal is completely dry. So I'm going to do 2 things. The first one of those is I'm going to add a little bit of reverb. I'm going to come into a new auxiliary bus. I'm going to make sure that it's stereo. And what I'm going to do is to come into the reverb options and I'm going to choose Space Designer. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come and have a look at the available spaces to me. I want something relatively large. We're not going to use masses of this, but I want a nice sort of big space to go around the vocal. I'm going to choose a plate reverb, which I think will just give us a sort of nice wraparound sound. I'm going to choose this big plate option. This has got a long reverb time of over 4 seconds, but I think what it'll help us to do is to just place this vocal into the space of the track altogether. Let's have a listen.
Loving ain't simple with you anymore. We have become opposites. No, loving ain't simple with you anytime. Battle lines drawn.
Okay, now that's quite washy, but in the context of this particular piece, I think that works quite nicely. It's filling in the spaces between those phrases and we're hearing it there, and it's got this slightly kind of haunting echoey quality, which feels about right. Now, because this reverb has only been added to the vocal channel, it's not being used by any of the other sounds, there are 2 ways in which we can control how much volume this reverb has. We can change the amount of send level, that's the amount that the vocal is being sent to this reverb over here, using our control here. And equally, because this vocal is the only sound that's using this reverb, of course, what we can also do is to change the volume of the actual return channel for that reverb over here as well. So if I wanted to address the volume of the reverb, I can do that in 2 ways. So what we've done in this video is to look at 4 things that have allowed us to configure a channel strip for a vocal within the context of a song project. What we've done is to look at tone using channel EQ. We've looked at compression to manage the dynamic range between the quietest and the loudest moments. And we've introduced de-essing, which is the process of a frequency sensitive control to allow us to just make sure that we're attenuating or dropping the volume of any particular frequencies that are sibilant, S sounds. And then lastly, what we've done is we've added a little bit of space to the vocal with a reverb plugin, a dedicated reverb plugin that's only affecting the vocal, which is just helping that vocal to sit in the track.